we are partnering with American Battlefield Trust to preserve historic sites all over the United States. Right now, we can save 161 acres across Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Thanks to matching funds, every $1 you give becomes $54 to preserve these hallowed grounds. Yes, you heard me right. Every $1 you donate becomes $54 towards preserving these battlefields. And for a limited time, when you contribute $50 or more, you'll receive a copy of Battlefields in Focus, a stunning photo book of these historic American sites. Click on the link in the show notes to do your part towards preserving American history.
He actually, she told me, did Jeep shows with Mickey Rooney. Not only did I not know that, I did not know there were enlisted entertainers.
My grandfather was in the Battle of the Bulge. My grandfather drove a tank in the Battle of the Bulge.
These Jeep shows were 3 enlisted entertainers, MOS 442s, and a driver. So Sammy Davis Jr. may have been the first person to integrate the U.S. Army.
Mickey Rooney is the biggest box office draw in 1939, 1940, and 1941. Think of someone like Brad Pitt or Tom Cruise going to the front line. You're bringing the big star to you. When you deploy, it's like time stands still.
On today's podcast, we are doing an interview with author Robert O'Connor. He's the author of Jeep Show, a novel, a trooper at the Battle of the Bulge. This is a fascinating book. I think you guys are really going to enjoy this topic. 30-year-old dance instructor Jim Tanzer enlists in the Army in 1943. He gets assigned to the Morale Corps because of his show business background. He's classified as MOS 442, entertainment specialist. This is a true, real MOS that was used in World War II and something that I learned about during our interview. Private Jim Tanzer is shipped to the European Theater of Operations and assigned to Jeep shows. 3 enlisted entertainers are driven to the front lines where they put on small variety shows. Private Mickey Rooney leads Jim's squad. He's caught in the Battle of the Bulge. Jim retreats to Bastogne where he's attached to Team Snafu, a hastily organized unit composed of survivors from overrun infantry companies. This interview, you guys are really going to enjoy it because I think this is a much lesser known part of World War II history with some really famous names that we're going to talk about in people who weren't well known when they went into World War II, became world famous actors after World War II. You'd be surprised at some of the names coming out of this entertainment specialist rating after World War II and some of those names that you would know from the entertainment industry.
Yeah, this is a rarely hit on part of American history, and I want people to know that these men were soldiers. They weren't USO performers. They were actual soldiers who were entertainers and went to the front line in a Jeep to perform for the soldiers. It is something that doesn't get told very often and such an important part of American morale during World War II. So welcome to our show, and we're going to have a great conversation about this book, and we'll talk more after.
Robert, thanks so much for joining us. For our listeners, before we jumped on air, Robert and I were joking that we actually live in the same area, and Robert probably could have driven down and sat down in our studio with us, although I would have had to do some preparing.
Right.
So,
and I would have had to put on trousers.
Yeah, exactly.
We're both wearing
my pajama pants right now. Right, it's the beauty of podcasting is for the most part it's audio only, but now that we've started video, it's just kind of chest up. So it's a t-shirt right. and that's right. Basically it. So. But yes, so Robert is the author of Jeep Show. But Robert, what I wanted to start off with, aside from just the funny fact that you live basically down the street from us, is how did this subject matter kind of first pique your interest? Like, what gave you the idea? Like, ooh, I should write a book about this.
I started my career in marketing at Procter & Gamble, and Procter & Gamble's a written culture, and I got sent almost immediately to remedial memo writing school to learn how to write the Procter & Gamble way. The teacher was a man named Gib Carey. Gib Carey had been the Oxydol brand manager in 1968. He had been approached by a circus promoter by the name of Jim Hetzer.
Huh.
And Jim Hetzer sold him on the idea of promoting this nationwide traveling circus under the Oxydol. Oxydol is a brand of detergent, no longer popular. And Gib Carey bought off on the idea. It turned out to be a disaster, hilarious only in retrospect. Gib Carey survived at P&G. But so I thought someday I will write about the Oxydol circus. After I wrote my first book, which was nonfiction, kind of self-help book, I started researching the topic, and I got in touch with Jim Hetzer's daughter, Jim, the circus promoter's daughter. And Jim is long passed away. And she said, "Oh, yes, I know all about that. Did you know that my father, Jim Hetzer, was an enlisted entertainer in World War II?" And I said, not only did I not know that, I did not know there were enlisted entertainers in
I didn't realize that either. And we were we were chit-chatting before as we were kind of getting ready for the interview. This reminded us a little bit of the movie White Christmas with Bing Crosby and Dan Kay. Mm-hmm. And so when we saw this, we're like, oh, that's probably what they were.
A Jeep show.
They were probably some form of a Jeep show. So sorry, I interrupted, but please continue.
So I said, wow, that he was an enlisted entertainer. Yeah, it was MOS 442, enlisted entertainer. He actually, she told me, did Jeep shows with Mickey Rooney, who was in 1939 the #1 worldwide box office star.
Absolutely.
But Mickey Rooney joined the Army in about 1944, and she explained that these Jeep shows they would be 3 enlisted entertainers, MOS 442s, and a driver. They would be in a Jeep. They would go to just behind the front lines, and they would do small 3-man variety shows for combat infantry who might be pulled back half a mile to get a hot meal, possibly a shower, possibly a uniform exchange. But they would do these shows, and it was sort of a vaudeville type show. They'd sing, they'd dance, they'd tell jokes, they'd do impressions. They would almost always pull a soldier out of the audience who, his buddies would say, "Oh yeah, Joe can sing," or whatever. Yeah. Joe does an amazing impression of Jimmy Cagney. And then they would hang around afterwards, smoke some cigarettes, drink some coffee, and just talk. And I became quite interested in the topic. I've always been interested in the topic of morale and how you build morale and how you keep morale, and how, morale is what gets you to do the tough things when you don't want to. The things need to be done, but you don't want to do them. That to me is morale. So I said, oh, and she said, by the way, Jim Hetzer's older sister saved every letter he wrote home from the European Theater of Operations.
Oh, how cool.
And she said, and also every letter he wrote home from New York when he was trying to make it in show business in the late 30s. And so I said, oh my goodness, can I come down to Dallas and, look at those letters? I'll put on, white cotton gloves and be very careful with them. And she said, oh, you don't need to. My sister published them in a book.
Oh my gosh.
So I bought this book of basically it's just several hundred letters from this enlisted entertainment man writing home, and read those. And then, in the endless internet, I stumbled upon the Morale Corps guidebook written by the Army for these soldiers and their officers, about a 75-page guidebook about how to put on these Jeep shows, how to put on what were called soldier shows, which were done in the rear echelon using soldiers for the cast and the crew. So I had these 2 primary sources. And then at some point, I decided that it was going to have to be fiction because I wanted to involve Jim in the Battle of the Bulge. And I wanted to get him caught up in that because the Battle of the Bulge remains the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army. So that was and I bought a book called, How to Write a Novel, and read it a few times. And, the main difference for me from nonfiction is in nonfiction, you just tell the reader what you want to tell them. But in fiction, if you just tell the reader what you want to tell them, it gets really boring. Mm-hmm. So you really have to show them what you want to tell them through what people do and what people say. So that was the inspiration.
I absolutely love it because, to your point, my brain is firing off on so many tangents that I would love to go down. But to your point about morale and a story like this, because a lot of times World War II stories and novels, and whether they're fiction or nonfiction, can be relatively serious, but a story like this lends itself to some entertainment. And to your point about morale, right? Soldiers and sailors, for our perspective, right? We're former Navy, current Navy.
Yes,
and
I know.
The soldiers that struggle together, that laugh together, that live together, are that much closer. And so I love that you interwove the true kind of MOS, right? This entertainment specialist that not a lot of people knew about, but there's a big name of Mickey Rooney, and then you have this character, and I love that this is basically based off of someone that was real life with letters and everything, and then interweaving that into the Battle of the Bulge, which is a relatively well-known conflict, but weaving those together to kind of give potentially what probably could have happened, to someone out there. It's just fascinating, and I'm actually looking forward to reading it because we just got the book, a day or two ago.
Well, I love this too for many different reasons, but I love the human story, right? So what's going on? Men are out there fighting. Men are out there dying. It's young men of America who are out there in, like you said, the Battle of the Bulge. My grandfather was in the Battle of the Bulge. My grandfather drove a tank in the Battle of the Bulge, and they're out there, and there's no end in sight. They don't know when they're going home. They don't know when the break is. And so these Jeep shows, which are so great because they're so mobile and so fast. A Jeep show, which I learned, consists of basically a Jeep with a driver and 3 entertainers. And so they can get right to the front line. They can get to where these men are as they're advancing, and they can give them a break, and they can give them a sense of humanity, and they can give them a sense of remembering what they're fighting for, and laughter, and just the good in the world. And that's what I love about this book, because when it really comes down to warfare and fighting, like, you can't be at that level 100% without something behind it for which the motivation for what you're fighting for.
Was there anything in the letters when you were kind of going through them that was kind of just surprising, whether it was about Mickey Rooney or about the events that Jim kind of had gone through when you were going through those letters doing your research?
I think the letters as a whole were just, it was just surprising that this existed at all, and yet in a way not. The Jeep show, the concept was developed by a captain in what I call the Morale Corps. It was actually called Special Services during the war. It had been called the Morale Corps until 1942, and they called it Special Services. But the Broadway director, Captain Joshua Logan, who directed South Pacific and many other famous Broadway shows.
Oh, how cool.
Realized the Army had moved very quickly from France, the Normandy area of France, the hedgerows, which were a bit of a problem. But after the Army broke out from there, they moved much more quickly to the German border than was expected. So you had these combat troops essentially guarding the German border. It was relatively quiet. Patton's Third Army was heading up from the south, getting ready to cross over in force in December of 1944. But so the whole Morale Corps, Mickey Rooney and Jim Hetzer, had come over as part of a big GI show called Hip Hooray with a band. And what they were expecting is they were going to take this show around England and then France. And, it was pretty good duty.
Yeah.
But Captain Joshua Logan disbanded the show and organized them into Jeep show units. three entertainers. So first of all, I was surprised that they didn't know the duty that they were going to be doing when they came over. Although you both are veterans, you know what that's like, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, you show up expecting to do one job and you end up doing something completely different.
You do it
exactly, and they never tell you why.
That's right. We just need you to do it. Go and do it. Okay.
Yeah, they never tell you why. So that was the probably the most surprising thing. But then I think, as you know, soldiers and sailors and airmen and you're given this crazy duty to do, and you just do it and you get used to it. So that became their routine, and they would do as many as 10 or 11 shows a day.
Wow.
They would be going up and down the front lines, and as you may or may not know, since you're sailors, is on the front line in World War II, the Army would disperse company-size units in various villages and hamlets and all that. So there'd be, Baker Company would be in one village, and then 10 miles up the road, Charlie Company would be in another. So it's that size unit. So these Morale Corps soldiers, these entertainers, would just be going up and down the border in their Jeep.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So they drive to company, and
exactly.
Their shows would be about an hour, 45 minutes, hour long?
Shows would be about an hour, and then they try to hang out for an hour, for a bit. Obviously, Mickey Rooney would sign autographs.
Yeah,
sure.
None of the other guys were asked for their autograph.
Yeah.
By the way, Mickey Rooney was, of course, world famous when he was doing this, and I'm full of respect for him because he did not have to go overseas. He could have done his Army service in Hollywood.
Oh, yeah.
But there were many, many men who were not the least bit famous when they were 442's Morale Corps soldiers, but became famous. You've heard of Mel Brooks, Young Frankenstein.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Sammy Davis Jr. was a famous entertainer and friend of Frank Sinatra's back in the 60s, 50s, and 60s.
No way.
And actually,
that's cool.
You probably know, there's a little trivia, and, since I'm not a historian, Jen, I really shouldn't say this, but I will anyways. The Army was segregated in World War II. Well, Sammy Davis Jr. was a black man, of course, and he was on a Jeep show squad with two other white soldiers. So Sammy Davis Jr. may have been the first person to integrate the U.S. Army.
What a cool thing.
That's my theory. I should back that up with some research, but then Burt Lancaster, Dick Van Dyke, Red Button. So a lot, it became kind of of course there were probably dozens and dozens and dozens of entertainers like Jim Tanzer, the protagonist, who were not of that star caliber, but did their job.
So I want people to realize that Mickey Rooney is the biggest box office draw in 1939, 1940, and 1941. So in essence, think of someone like Brad Pitt or Tom Cruise going to the front line, and you're in your little company, and I'd say little, like, you're with your couple hundred of your
right
cohorts, and they come to perform, and you're like, oh my gosh, it's Tom Cruise.
Yeah.
Oh my God. And that does happen today. Sometimes you will get a big name star who does stuff like that. And you do want to spend that time after to talk to them and to just, humanize it and be like, oh my, this is amazing. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for getting to meet you. And they want to thank you for what you're doing. So I just want people to realize how big of a star Mickey Rooney was doing this.
Mickey Rooney was also, if it was Tom Cruise today, and I think Tom Cruise has done some good service, at least for the Air Force, that would be a USO show.
Yeah.
And the USO shows they're fabulous work, and they did fabulous work in World War II, but they couldn't go anywhere near the front lines because it was too dangerous. If you're going to risk somebody's life to provide entertainment to the combat soldiers who are risking their life every day, it's got to be somebody who's under orders.
Yeah.
It's got to be an enlisted.
In the military.
Enlisted. Yeah, exactly. Mickey Rooney was a genius. Many of the directors that worked with him said he was the most talented actor they ever worked with, and his private life was completely out of control, off the rails. But he was a hard worker and a genius. So, yeah, and in these letters that I was reading, these actual letters, I got a fair amount of descriptions of what it was like to work with Mickey Rooney.
I think that would have been fascinating, and maybe after we're done, I'll shoot you an email and see if we can get the name of that book with the letters in there, because I'm sure some of our listeners and viewers would be interested.
I'll
in that
I'll walk 2 blocks over and hand it to you.
Exactly.
We'll have to meet up for coffee sometime.
So what you did is you took, is it Jim Hetzer became
Jim Hetzer was the real person.
And became Jim Tanzer.
I made him into Jim Tanzer, and Tanzer is the German word for dancer, by the way, which...
okay. That's cool.
Which you're now the only other 2 people that know that.
Well, I mean, writers always have, they have little eggs that they're sticking in there.
Easter eggs, yes.
So
one of the ones I put in there, several veterans of combat infantry that I've talked with about the book love a little Easter egg in there about what's called M1 thumb. The M1 Garand rifle was the standard issue rifle to infantry in World War II, and you loaded a 9-round clip on the top of it. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you put that, hit that clip in its place, the bolt shot back on its own. And if your thumb was trailing a little bit in the way of that bolt, it would really hurt. So you could see guys that had black and blue thumbs, and that was called M1 thumb. And I put a little Easter egg in there. I didn't name it, but I just said something like, Jim. The instructor, the drill instructor, was like, "You love your M1 rifle," and Jim looks down at his black and blue thumb and he thinks, "I do not love my M1 rifle."
I love that. So
when you were kind of moving on to the piece of the Battle of the Bulge, did you, as you were researching that, had you seen anything where there was units like this that kind of got caught up in it? Or was this kind of, you were just like, no, this is kind of the more of the historical fiction piece of it to kind of interweave it with this large conflict?
They're somewhere in the middle, in that, I read several excellent nonfiction books about the Battle of the Bulge, and the American units on the front line, some of them were quickly overwhelmed. Many of them held out for a long time against the overwhelming German numbers, but some of them were overwhelmed. So you would have survivors of overwhelmed infantry companies moving back on foot or in a jeep if they had one. And then, for example, 5 miles behind the front line was regimental headquarters there's going to be all sorts of personnel in regimental headquarters, telephone operators, bakers, cooks, mechanics, who do not, are not daily, are not combat soldiers. They do know how to fire a rifle. So it's clear that many, many hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers of all kinds were moving away from the German army and trying to kind of retreat in a disorganized fashion for some of them. So, and then Bastogne became kind of a collecting point. Mm-hmm. The soldiers would basically try to make their way to Bastogne, and then when they got to Bastogne, they were relatively quickly organized into what was called Team Snafu, and most of your listeners probably know what Snafu stands for. It's a family show, so I won't go into it in great detail. But so Jim's retreat, half a mile ahead of the Germans at all time, traces some of the important points, geography and battles of the defense in the Battle of the Bulge, in that he retreats from the front line, from a frontline company strong point, to Clairvaux, where the regimental headquarters was. Clairvaux is overwhelmed within a day. He retreats from there to Antonioschaff, and that Antonioschaff is just a crossroads, but the army sent up mixed teams of armor and soldiers just to buy time, just to slow the Germans down long enough that Patton and his army could get up from the south. So Jim is at the crossroads, and then he retreats to WWII, which was then overwhelmed about a day later, and then he retreats into Bastogne. And as we all know, Bastogne gets under siege, but Bastogne holds out. And interestingly, I had the famous General McAuliffe of Bastogne fame. I have him ordering Jim to put on a show for the wounded soldiers and civilians in the cellar.
Oh, wow.
That part I made up completely. I am not aware of a variety show being put on, but because of the German artillery and bombing, all the wounded had to be in the cellars. So I was basing it on the real facts that soldiers were retreating. All kinds of soldiers, whether they were combat infantry or in the regimental band, were turned into a fighting force in Bastogne. And so Jim kind of his journey back shows all those things.
That's so great. Like I said, this would make a great movie.
This would make a phenomenal movie.
A great movie.
Yeah, we'll see.
So I want our listeners to know two things too as we're talking. So first of all, a lot of these actors, Mickey Rooney included, are vaudeville actors. And you had talked a little bit about vaudeville. Vaudeville is this variety show. It is this stand-up variety show. So this wasn't something kind of new to them to kind of improvise. They had done this early in their careers. And these vaudeville shows were these traveling shows that went around to all the towns in America, small towns, big towns, and they would sing, they would dance, they would do a little acting, they would do a little number. And so they were very used to this variety, whatever you had available, whatever you could do to entertain people. And it also meant those actors were very well versed in different types of performances. They could sing, they could dance, they could play an instrument. So they could kind of improvise wherever they were and make a show based on that. So I want people to understand vaudeville is kind of a lost art today, but this is the foundation of a lot of these actors at the time. Mickey Rooney was big, Bob Hope, and that's where they kind of got their start. I also want people to know how American the Jeep is. Like the Jeep and the Higgins boat, like these are things that they were developed for the war. They are very American mechanics. And so the Jeep utilized in this way is also something that is very like, it's kind of like industrial meets morale and used together. So I want people to understand that as well, because I think that is something that's very unique and cool about this book and history, that the Jeep is so American and fighting this World War II, a very much, America's pulled into this huge conflict. So.
Yeah, and for me, the Jeep is incredibly symbolic of the war, but it is also symbolic of American industry. By 1943, America was producing more war material than all the other belligerents combined, Germany, Russia, England, France. And the Jeep was a classic example. We made 600,000 Jeeps.
Oh my gosh.
And shipped them to the Russians. The Russians loved Jeeps. So we made 600,000 Jeeps, and it's a perfect emblem of how America's industrial capacity was absolutely overwhelming and absolutely emblematic of America, because we had invented the automobile industry and we had invented mass production. And what I learned is many of the German weapons, very excellently designed weapons, but they were, and the Japanese as well, but they were kind of complicated. And so if a Tiger tank broke down, it couldn't get a part from a smaller Panzer, whereas with the American equipment, every Jeep was exactly the same.
Yeah.
And if you had to, you'd steal a distributor from somebody else's Jeep to make yours go. But so the Jeep was not only kind of an emblem of the war, but it was an emblem of one of the things that made America great in the 20th century, which was mass production at scale in a way that no other nation in the world did.
No.
Yeah, and it's fun that your book, right, has that in the title, Jeep Show, because we've talked. A couple weeks ago we were talking to a photographer who had made this photography book about World War II bomber jacket art. And
I listened to it. Yeah, great show.
It was so interesting hearing from him kind of what he learned about another thing that is so classically American, this art that made it on to those bomber jackets, those flight jackets.
Right.
And I love that this iconic American symbol that was the Jeep of World War II is going from unit to unit to unit, driving around. So I think it's just kind of integrated perfectly both into the title and to the storyline.
I found a patch. That went on your uniform that said Jeep Show, U.S. Army Jeep Show. And they're not common, but...
Yeah, I found that, Yeah, I'd love to see that because I'm not sure if we found the same thing, but I would love to see that.
Yeah, it's kind of like a arc, that goes on your shoulder. And it just reminds me, like, this is honorable military service. Like, Mickey Rooney got the Bronze Star for this. Like, this is military service, and it's something that is definitely needed, and it's something that kind of sets America apart, which I always appreciate too. And I want to remind people, I don't think our generation gets it as much, so I try to always compare, right? But Laurence Olivier called Mickey Rooney the greatest actor of all time. Right. Like, this would be an A-list actor out there. This would be like Tom Hanks out there performing. Like, this is the big dog is out there
in a uniform. In a uniform with in the military with his rifle. With his rifle somewhat nearby just in case. Yes, absolutely.
And these men, even though they're performers, like you said, with a rifle. Any time you're in the military, no matter what your job is, you are expected to be a soldier first. So if these men get caught in any conflict, they are still expected to be a soldier. They are still expected to hold their weapon, hold their ground, and do their job. And so that's what sets these men apart too from those USO performers.
Right. One of the points you made with that excellent show you did about nose art in military aviation is, you said that, and your expert said the flight jackets were morale builders. And, one of the fundamental quotes I came across is Napoleon said, morale is to the material as 3 is to 1. Mm-hmm. And so, the Army had many programs to build morale. In the rear echelon, it was as much as anything to keep soldiers out of trouble, young soldiers who were bored. But then on the front lines, they had these Jeep shows. They had Army Service Edition books that were passed from foxhole to foxhole. And they would do foxhole, the frontline guys would do foxhole newsletters. So, morale is a fundamentally important topic in war and in World War II. But to me, morale is a fundamentally important topic that we all can study. And that was part of the genesis of why I was so interested in this topic and these morale corps soldiers.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, right? You talk about morale, and you talk about the letters that they would get. I mean, I think even Tyler Perry had made that movie about the 6888, right? The first all black female, basically male unit that went and kind of got cleared up the backlog of mail throughout Europe. Right. I remember being on the ship, both times that my couple deployments, like one of the things you were looking forward to was when the mail would come in. This was before you could like FaceTime home and all the stuff that you can do nowadays with all these like satellite links and everything. But in the early 2000s, we were just starting to get email. So letters and packages with all the goodies from home were such a huge morale builder for us as we're deployed somewhere in the Arabian Gulf. Yeah. So to that point, morale is such an important thing. That's why the USO was started. That the Office of Special Services wasn't just doing stuff that like John Ford was filming stuff at the front lines, but they were also doing these entertainment bits. So I absolutely love the subject matter. Yeah,
and Robert, you also have letters in your book, and you have him writing his wife. You have Mickey Rooney talking about who he's gonna marry next, which is kind of funny. Right. Like, it's Mickey Rooney. If you don't know, he's known for that as well. Yeah, right. So those letters are always such an important part of military history. And morale is all about bringing a piece of home to you,
Yes,
right?
yes,
Morale is always
absolutely.
like, that's why it's part of like the artwork is so American, like folk art of the jackets and these actors. Like you're bringing Mickey Rooney to you. You're bringing the big star to you. You're bringing a letter home from home to you. You carry those letters with you because you're keeping a piece of home with you. And it kind of reminds you what you're fighting for, what you're putting on the line, what your motivation is. And it's always like if you can be constantly reminded of that and have that in the forefront of your mind. And that's why these Jeep shows were so important, because they went to the guys in the front line and brought home to them right in the forefront of their mind. So they're right before they're doing like the most amazing thing that they're asked for of their country, they're reminded of why they're doing it. And that's
absolutely.
the most important thing. But I love the letters. The letter part is always that's a wartime staple. That's something that really gives you insight to how a person's feeling and thinking, because usually they're not going to reveal that to their fellow soldier, but they'll reveal it in a letter. So it's a great way to get an understanding of how they're really thinking and feeling at the time.
Yeah.
And I think
my impression was also for frontline combat soldiers in World War II, and I think for sailors, deployed to the other side of the globe, as you all were, it is easy to feel isolated. Like, do people even think about us here in the Gulf or, here in the Ardennes forest where it's freezing cold and we're in are people thinking about us? And so, nothing's better than letters from home, but the physical presence of these entertainment soldiers was almost as good. Yeah, you are not forgotten. We are here. I agree with you, Jen.
I love that. And like Scott and I, we both deployed. I tell people this all the time. When you deploy, it's like time stands still. It's like you miss all the movies, you miss all the music. It's like it didn't happen while you're deployed. So what you come back to is what you remember the last time you left. So it's nice to kind of have that reach back from home of what's the new song right now? What's the big movie right now? People who are doing this are also bringing news from home. And they're also able to tell you, well, this is what's happening right now. This is what is going on in America right now. And that also is something that soldiers, when you get that feeling as, does anyone know I'm here? You also feel like you're not seeing what's happening back home. So you're kind of stuck in a time capsule, more or less. So I like that these people are kind of like your tether to America. And
as now the service is mostly young people, 18 to 24, and you've got a different understanding of life and family and all that. So very, very important. As Napoleon said, morale is to the material as 3 is to 1.
Yeah, I like that. You have that in the very front of your book.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah. That and the quote about we're gonna take all the pool tables and put them in battalion headquarters.
But see,
and that was
handling.
I was trying to indicate with that. I mean, the American production for the military was just incredible in World War II. Now, a lot of things didn't make it to the front lines, but the American production. So we shipped 5,000 pool tables over to the European Theater of Operations.
Wow.
That's crazy.
And those aren't light.
Yeah. No.
So let me ask you also, how long did it take you to write this book? Like, how long were you
too long. Way too long. And I'll tell you why. Research is fun and writing is hard.
Yeah.
I probably started working on this. I published the first book in 2006. So I'd say 5 years.
Okay.
5 years. As I say, I went down a lot of rabbit holes, and the sequel. I've started the sequel, which may involve Jim in the Korean War in some way or other, and it certainly will involve the GI Bill. My dad was in the Army in World War II, and blue-collar Irish Catholic kid, and ended up going to Yale on the GI Bill.
Wow.
So cool.
So the GI Bill, and Jen, I'm an amateur historian, not a professional like you, but the GI Bill and the Civil Rights Movement were two things that absolutely changed the fabric of America. And both those things I want to try to touch on in the next book or the one after that. I'm proposing to be writing a series here that would take up to the Oxydol Circus. I set out to write about the Oxydol Circus, and now Scott, that's volume 4.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great.
That's what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as you know, I'm thankful to the GI Bill. So 100%.
Yes.
I love that.
And there's a chapter in Jeep Show about the Morale Corps Battalion going over to Europe on the Queen Mary.
Yes.
Which was turned into a troop ship.
I
well,
saw
my
that.
dad went to Europe on the Queen Mary. So for
cool.
me, researching that, and it's a fascinating topic, researching the Queen Mary and how it was used as a troop ship, I really felt closer to my dad.
Yeah.
Because, of course, my dad was born in 1924. He did not talk about his World War II experience. And unfortunately, I was too young and self-centered to ask him. So, here I am writing this book about World War II and the European theater. And I'm just saying, God, I wish my dad were here.
Yeah.
Robert, I read that part. I loved how descriptive you are of what they do to the ship to make it ready for for all the troops on board. I have a friend who lives close to the Queen Mary, and every time I go out there, I'm like, I need to get out there and do a video.
Yes.
This motivated me to make that video because I feel like that story needs to be told. A lot of people know about the Queen Mary, but I don't think they know it was used as a troop transport during World War II. And that is such an interesting part of its career. And I would love to tell that story. So thank you. That part of your book really motivated me to want to make that video.
Let me know when you're going out there, because I need to go and actually walk through the ship as well. For your listeners, the Queen Mary was the luxury liner of its time, the mid to late 1930s. Its capacity was 3,200 passengers and crew. They turned it into a troop ship, and it carried 16,000.
Oh my gosh!
Soldiers and crew. So they were in a guest room that that was intended for 2 passengers. They were bunking, 18 GIs in the same thing. So, and some of these were below the waterline, so you can imagine. Well, you're Navy.
Yeah.
You know what it's like, what it can be like below the waterline with a lot of bodies sleeping in the same room.
It's so funny when you mentioned the Queen Mary, because growing up in Southern California, right? That's where I'm born and raised in Southern California. So I actually had my high school senior prom on the Queen Mary. So that was like a thing that we did out there. That was just a thing. And so my high school, my senior high school prom was on the Queen Mary. And so it's so funny how, we all have different ties to it. Your father went over to Europe on it, and I had my high school senior prom on it. Now that it's basically a museum ship / restaurant.
What do we call that, Scott? Going from the sublime to the absurd?
Yeah, exactly.
That's so interesting. Well, we thank you today for being on the show.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us where we can get the book. Tell us more about where we can find out more about you and your next project.
Yes. Yeah. The book, Jeep Show, A Trooper at the Battle of the Bulge, is on Amazon and also bookshop.org if you don't love Amazon. You can go directly there, or my website, jeepshowbook.com, gives my bio and a lot of backstory about the book. And it has an essay. I wrote an essay. There's a war correspondent character in the book. And I had him write an essay at the end of the war, looking back on the war and how things were ending. There's always a bittersweet when a war ends. You don't get even though you're the victor, and you don't get everything you want, and compromises have to be made. But I'll just read you the last 2 sentences of this essay, which is on the website. That's why I brought it up. My editor cut it out of the book, but the last 2 sentences. America fielded millions of citizen soldiers who disliked the goddamn army, were ambivalent about their officers, and resisted the trappings of military hierarchy, also known as chicken shit. Yet many of them will remember their service as the ennobling experience of their lives. If you ask them, they will tell you they fought not for their country or lofty ideals, but for each other, for their buddies, to get the job done and get home. you guys and you two know about that.
That's so true.
Absolutely.
You get people who complain about the military nonstop, and the minute they get out, they're so proud to talk about their service. And you know what? They should be. I give them all that
Should
credit.
be.
But that is
should be
100% true.
Yeah, well,
Robert, look, thank you so much
Yeah.
for this, letting me talk to you and your listeners. It's really been a pleasure.
Yeah,
Really
this has been super fun. And maybe once you get that next project done, we'll actually have you over to the studio. Maybe we can meet up for coffee in the interim, or if we plan a trip out to the Queen Mary, we'll definitely let you know.
Yes, definitely let me know about that.
All right. So I'm going to...
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Jen.
He's singing in my about pretty boys.
So what did you guys think about the interview? I loved learning about the research that he did for this book, the letters, Jen. Mm-hmm. I thought that was fascinating. Like, you cannot get more, like a historian could not ask for more than primary source letters.
Well, and morale is something that's really getting hit on now about the history of World War II. The 688 just came out about the male and the morale of male. This is much more about on the front lines, the entertainment industry, and I love that. But if you want to get a copy of Robert O'Connor's book, again, it's available on his website. It's on Amazon.com. But he also wanted you to know that $1 for every one of his books goes to the Stars and Stripes, and that is a nonprofit organization that serves veterans. $1 for every sale of this book. I really feel like this book is going to be a movie someday, so it would be great for our listeners to read it first before they see it on the big screen.
Yeah, I loved some of the anecdotes. If you guys got to this point of the podcast, I'm sure you guys would be interested in it. There will be links in the show notes or the video description for where you can find this book, A Jeep Show, A Trooper at the Battle of the Bulge by Robert B. O'Connor. Please let us know what you think. Let us know if you learned anything in this podcast, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.
This has been a Walk with History production. Talk with History is created and hosted by me, Scott Benny. Episode researched by Jennifer Benny. Check out the show notes for links and references mentioned in this episode. Talk with History is supported by our fans at thehistoryroadtrip.com.
Our eternal thanks go out to those providing funding to help keep us going. Thank you to Doug McLiverty, Larry Myers, Patrick Benny, and Gail Cooper.